Now we are going to look at how the do-while loop works. Before I do that, I want to apologize for my voice because I've got a bad cold. So let's get going with the do-while loop. So the do-while loop is actually quite the inverse of the while loop. So it basically works in an inverse situation. Like in while loop, we had to go through the condition first, then we would have the privilege of executing the clause that we had after the condition. But in a do-while loop, the situation is actually inverted. We would be going through this clause first, then we would actually go to check the condition whether the condition is true or false. In all the cases, whenever you get a condition, you're always going to check whether the condition is true or not. It must always render out to be a Boolean value of true. If it is false, your loop is going to terminate or your conditional statement is not going to work. So until and unless you get a condition that is true, your code won't work. So let's get going. And first we are going to look at how the do-while loop works. So let's erase this off. Now the syntax of the do-while loop is pretty simple and it's quite explanatory. So it starts with the do-while. It's not like that. Okay. I made the same mistake again. So place a semicolon. Okay. So this is basically the syntax of the do-while loop. Now the do-while loop, as you can see, it contains something called a while statement. And the while statement is terminated using the semicolon at the end. Previously, when we had looked at how the while loop and the for loop work, we did not see any sort of semicolon applied either to this condition or to this clause. Neither of them had any sort of semicolon applied to it. But if you do not include the semicolon at the end of the while conditioning inside this do-while loop, then your code your code won't work. It's going to tell you that there is a bug inside your code like this. So if you erase this off, when there is an execution part during the runtime, your program will throw an error. So it's always safe to add the semicolon at the beginning of writing your loop statements. Now the do-while loop, it's pretty self-explanatory, which means it is like the do-while loop is, if we read this literally, it will tell the compiler do these processes or execute these processes first. Then after you have done execution at least for once, then check for the condition whether the condition is true or not. If the condition is not true, then your loop is going to terminate at the semicolon. But if your condition is true, which means your condition is not false, then your loop is not going to terminate at the semicolon. Your semicolon will be ignored for the timing by the compiler, and then it will get back to this it will get back to the beginning of the looping statement. So it means that your loop will at least execute for once. Now in the previous parts we had seen, like if we have included a while, then in also the for loop we had something like this, which means your code or your compiler had to go through the condition first before it could go inside this clause. And similarly, inside the while statement or the while loop, your compiler had to check, or there was a check before the compiler could enter the clause. It's like that. It's like a palace. This clause is like a palace. So before you can enter the palace, you had to go through a checking process with the guards. The guards need to, like the airports. In modern day, we have the airports. So before you can actually board an airplane, you will have to go through a rigorous checking. So when you pass that checking, which means you are true, or you're truly a traveler, or you're not someone who's going to cause any sort of trouble, then the people in the airport, or the what do they call them, the aviation officers or the police, they're going to let you pass through, and they're going to allow you to board the plane. This is something like that. So the compiler needs to go through this checking process first. It's going to check whether this condition is true. If this condition is true, then it is allowed to enter this clause. If the condition is not true, it's not going to enter this clause. So the inverse is actually occurring inside the do-while loop. So previously, we were checking for the condition first. Now, we are not going to check for the condition first. We are going to run the code first, at least for once. Then we are going to check for this condition, whether it is true or not. Inside this while statement and the for statement, likewise, we have the condition at the beginning, which means if your condition at the first iteration or at the first process is false, then your web page will be empty. It won't show anything on the web page. But if your condition is false inside the do-while loop, then at least it would show the first element on your web page, which means your do-while loop will at least run for once before terminating. But if the conditions inside the while loop and the for loop is false, it won't run. It won't run for not for a single time. It won't even run. It won't even enter this clause if the condition is false in the first iteration.